Hello and welcome to the practice edition for the Race Weekend Data Analysis Pilot Series for the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2020. My name is Alex Does F1 Stuff and I hope you're all having an awesome day. Now, if you have not seen, the idea of this pilot series is to basically look at all of the data from a particular race and set it up so I can bash this series out extremely well for 2021. And today I've taken on board some of the comments from episode 1 looking at Austria 2020 and episode 2, which was a awfully long episode, 54 minutes long for Styria, and I've taken those on board and produced 3 separate videos over the next 3 days covering the data from Hungary. As always, if there are any things that you would like to change, anything that I could add, anything that I could remove or move around or shuffle about in this episode, please let me know in the comments below. That is exactly what this series is designed for. So without further ado, we are just going to hop straight on into the practice data for the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2020. And of course, we will start off with the practice results. And practice number 1 was led by Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas, the 2 Mercedes dominating the 2 racing points. Technically, if you want to call it a Mercedes 1 down to 4. Then we have Ricciardo P5 in the Renault, the 2 Ferraris ahead of Max Verstappen struggling in the Red Bull, then Norris and Ocon battling with Sainz for P9 also. And then a little bit further down that order we have Albon in P13, Grosjean P14 and Latifi P15, with Kubica filling in for Kimi Raikkonen in the Alfa Romeo. And then practice 2, it is a rain-affected session. Sebastian Vettel for Ferrari leads it by 0.2 ahead of Valtteri Bottas and then 1.3 seconds back to Carlos Sainz. These lap times are over 30 seconds slower than the previous lap times in practice number 1. And then finally, practice 3, it is once again a Mercedes 1-2 ahead of Sergio Perez in the Racing Point and Charles Leclerc putting in an enormous performance in the Ferrari. And then Lance Stroll is P5, Max Verstappen is struggling in the Red Bull in P6, Norris P7, Vettel 8th and Gasly 9th. And so the first thing that we do is we map on all of these lap times onto a small little graph and we end up with something that looks a bit like this, a sort of inverse V shape. Now unfortunately, as practice 2 was covered in rain, we do have this really awkward shape on the graph, which means there isn't a great deal of detail that we can actually take, but equally not a lot of drivers actually ran in practice 2, so when we get into the teammate breakdowns, we can actually see some detail in some teams, but not all of them. And then again, from this information, I can calculate the teams that have made the most improvements from FP1 to FP2, and then FP2 to FP3, although it's not going to be particularly relevant as we have a 20-odd second gap, but we can do it nonetheless. So the most improved team from FP1 to FP2 is technically Ferrari, losing just 23 seconds. It sounds ridiculous, but that is the case when wet weather is involved. And then the most progress made from FP2 to FP3 is actually Renault, gaining 26 seconds on those 2 times. Now, I'm still not 100% sure what to do with this panel, but this is all I've done so far. I could end up mapping on whoever makes the most improvements, etc., and we can see which session some teams prefer and who makes the most progress in some particular session. So that could be something I could do. But we're now just going to head on into the teammate battles, and we start, of course, with Mercedes. I've also added some little colours around the background, so they are slightly different from just the grey and the black as previous. And along with the colour changes, I've also shifted around the look of these panels as well. So the first thing we start with today is their positions charts. In FP1, FP2 and FP3, notice the gap in Styria for FP3 as that session was not run. And then slap bang in the middle of this panel, we can put the Mercedes progression. Now, like I said, there isn't going to be a great deal of detail visible in this, and especially as Lewis Hamilton did not run in practice 2, failing to set a time, you can only really see his 2 dots, which also cover Valtteri Bottas's. And unfortunately, there is that almost 30-second spread. And then next up, we can include the head-to-head in practice. So far, it is 2-1 to Lewis Hamilton in FP1, 2-1 to Valtteri Bottas in FP2, and then 1 apiece for the 2 Mercedes in FP3. I can then over here on the right just map on their practice gaps. So in practice 1, Lewis Hamilton was ahead by just 0.08 of a second. There was then no gap in FP2 as Lewis Hamilton did not run, and there was just under half a tenth gap in favour of Valtteri Bottas in practice 3. And then an addition that was left by a commenter on the previous video was to map on their average practice gaps so far, so we can compare what the Hungary data looks like to their season's average. Now, this average was a little bit awkward to work out as first, as I was really debating in my head whether to include the current race that we are looking at within this average, and I eventually chose not to. So this average will always be the race's previous, averaged out, and we can see what the lap times are, and it will always be the average whenever that driver is in front. I'm not adding up all of the gaps and then dividing and seeing who comes out on top after that. I'm adding up all of the gaps where Lewis Hamilton was in front, dividing by that number, all of the gaps that Valtteri Bottas was in front, divided by that number for FP1, 2 and 3. And if I send it back to the panel, we end up with a graph that looks a little something like this in the bottom right. So the averages for FP1, Lewis Hamilton is about 3.5 tenths in front, compared to Valtteri Bottas being just 0.03, but FP2 is where it swings. So in the first two races, Valtteri Bottas has a 6.5 tenth average advantage ahead of Lewis Hamilton in FP2 compared to 2 tenths, and then FP3 it is all dominated by Lewis Hamilton. And so with the pro formers all laid out, we move on into team number 2, and that is Red Bull. And they look something a bit like this. And once again, we can't see a great deal of detail in their progressions graph. And in the head-to-head, it is all Max Verstappen still. 3-0 in FP1, 3-0 in FP2, and 2-0 in FP3. And in the practice gaps, the FP3 gap was half a second to Alex Albon, and then 0.3 of a second in FP1. Albon has gone backwards. But comparing those to the averages previous, they're not quite there. Alex Albon was just a little bit closer than he has been the previous two races towards Max Verstappen. And then sending it back to team number 3 in the list, and that is McLaren, and these guys are even Stevens. FP2 was a little bit different, as that is an outlier recession as it was rain affected, and Carlos Sainz was 4.2 seconds ahead of Lando Norris, massively above his FP2 average. Now, I will also be excluding any rain-affected sessions from the average as well, as that is just a sensible thing to do. Otherwise, we do end up with big skews like this, including 4 seconds in an average where most of them are around 3 tenths to half a second. It's going to skew the data massively, so it's just easier to exclude it completely. But in the head-to-heads, it is 2-1 to Carlos Sainz in both FP1 and FP2, but 2-0 to Lando Norris in FP3. And then moving from McLaren, and we send it on to the Pink Panthers of Racing Point, and this is very similar to the Red Bull page. It is heavily dominated by Sergio Perez. 3-0 in FP1, 2-1 in FP2, and 2-0 in FP3 as well, with just a 900th gap ahead for Lance Stroll in FP2 this session. And comparing Sergio Perez's gaps to his averages so far, he's a little bit down on his FP1 average gap ahead to Lance Stroll, but he is a 10th up on his average in FP3. And then taking a look at team number 5, and that is Renault, and we can see that this is fairly even, and neither car ran in practice number 2, so we can actually see some detail in the graph. It is 3-0 to Daniel Ricciardo in practice 1, 1 apiece in practice 2, and 1 apiece in practice 3. And then looking at the race gaps, we can see it was Daniel Ricciardo that was ahead of Esteban Ocon, but comparing them to the averages, he is down significantly on his FP1 average, and he is up significantly on his FP3 average, as this is the first time ahead of Esteban Ocon in FP3. And then leaving Renault and the yellow team, we head on into Ferrari and the scarlet red. And we can see that it's fairly even, it's not too bad. It's actually 2-1 to Sebastian Vettel in practice 1, 2-1 to Sebastian Vettel in practice 2, but 2-0 to Charles Leclerc in practice 3. And once again, similar to the McLarens, we see this 3.2 second gap in practice 2, the rain affected session, in favour of Sebastian Vettel as he scored his P1. But taking a look at the gaps, Sebastian Vettel was ahead in FP1 by 1.6 tenths of a second, which is a tenth faster than his average so far this year, whereas Charles's FP3 advantage over Sebastian is half a second, which is significantly faster than his average so far. And so leaving Ferrari, we head on into Alfa Tauri and the battle between Gasly and Kvyat. Gasly didn't run in FP1, and because Kvyat did, it is a point towards Kvyat in the head-to-head. It is 2-1 in favour of Gasly in FP1, 2-1 to Gasly again in FP2, and 2-0 to Gasly in FP3 also. But once again, in the gaps chart in the far top right, we see a heavy skew, a 4.8 second gap in the rain affected session, with Gasly leading Kvyat. So the only gap that we can compare is the 8/10 advantage that he had over Kvyat in FP3, which is 5/10, half a second faster than the average over the previous 2 races so far. And then leaving the first Alfa team and heading to Alfa Romeo, the OG Alfa, and we see that once again it was Kimi Räikkönen that failed to run in FP1, which is a point towards Giovinazzi in the head-to-head. So it is 2-1 to Giovinazzi in FP1, 2-1 to Kimi Räikkönen in FP2, and 2-0 to Giovinazzi in FP3. And the only gap that we can take so far is the gap between them in FP2, the rain-affected session. Now, I'm not 100% sure if that's entirely right. I think I have made a small mistake there, as there should be a gap in FP3. Whether they set the exact same time, I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to check my data. Okie dokie, there we go. I just made a small mistake. I forgot to update the gaps chart. So the gap in FP2 is 9/10 of a second in favour of Kimi Räikkönen, and there is just a 300th difference between them in Giovinazzi's favour in FP3. And then heading into the penultimate team of today's episode, and that is Haas, and the battle between Magnussen and Grosjean. So far in FP1 and FP2, it is 2-1 towards Kevin Magnussen, but in FP3, it is 2-0 in favour of Romain Grosjean. Now, there is no gap to take in FP2 as Kevin Magnussen did not run, so that is a point towards Romain Grosjean in the FP2 head-to-head. So taking a look at the gaps, it is almost 0.2 of a second ahead in FP1, but there is no averages as of yet in the average gaps chart. So we look towards FP3 and it is 0.2 advantage for Romain Grosjean, which is a little bit down by just 0.06 of a second on his average so far. And so we head to the final teammate pairing, and that is Williams. Nicholas Latifi versus George Russell, another team with both drivers failing to run in FP2 in the rain-affected session. But in practice 1, it is actually Nicholas Latifi who has the advantage over Russell so far, but then in FP2 and FP3, it is 2-0 towards the Brit. And looking at the gaps chart on the right, it is a 0.6 gap that Nicholas Latifi has over George Russell in FP1, but so far there is no average as of yet in favour for Latifi. Whereas in FP3, it is an 0.8 gap in favour of George Russell, which is a little bit down, actually significantly down. It is a, 6/10 gap between his FP3 average so far. And there we go, there is all the practice data all wound up and all done and dusted for the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2020. If there is anything that has come in this video that you would like me to change, like me to add, like me to do otherwise, please let me know, as that is the whole point of this series. Dropping tomorrow will be the qualifying data for Hungary, very similar to this, and then dropping the day after that will be the race data. Now, if any of you are interested in any F1 official merch, like the Max Verstappen orange cap over my left shoulder, or the Suzuka track map as well, or if you'd like some cool F1 stickers over my other shoulder, then check out my Drive Crate unboxing for their January 2021 season preview. But thank you guys so much for watching. I've been Alex Does F1 Stuff, and if you've disagreed with anything that I've said or have any suggestions for video improvements, please let me know in the comments below, but I'll catch you in the next video.